you're lucky because I have to listen to myself every day. So I'm just messing around. Oh. Well, let's just pray again real quickly and just ask that God would be here this morning and that He'd be in the words that are said, and just as we listen and as we get ready to receive God's word. Father, I just ask that you would do amazing things this morning. That as we talk about worship and what it is, that Jesus, that you would just provoke us to response. That you would move our hearts towards you. And Jesus, that God, that we would just find you and encounter you in a way that maybe we haven't in a long time or ever before. Jesus, we love you, and it's all about you. It's why we're here. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All right. Well, I want to start this morning with a confession. And it kind of goes like this. The first time I ever experienced music, or as far as playing guitar or anything like that, I remember my dad taking me into a music shop when I was 12. And it was just after my birthday. And he took me and he bought me my first guitar. And at that point, I began to slowly construct an idol in my life. Over time, I began to develop this construct where whenever I thought of worship, I immediately thought of what we do when we sing songs on Sunday morning. Whenever I thought of the word worship, I immediately went to music. And what we do whenever we sing or whenever we have a Sunday morning gathering or a Wednesday night gathering. And so I got heavily involved in worship ministries and Sunday morning worship and singing. From an early age, I found so much life whenever we come together on Sunday mornings. I found so much life whenever the songs were being sung and the music was loud and the lights were dim. I found so much life, and I just waited for those times where I could go and I could quote unquote be in the presence of the Lord. And I could sing songs, or I could lead worship and witness as other people sang songs. And so I'll never forget how profoundly impacted I was a few years ago whenever I was at a worship gathering in Northwest Arkansas. And I was in the presence of friends as they sang and as they prayed, as they cried out to God. I was profoundly impacted because in that moment I felt nothing. And that moment, this thing that had always been so life-giving, so life-breathing, so important and central to my faith, was killing me. I couldn't pray. The prayers just felt like words, and the songs just felt like songs. And I realized in that moment, in that space, at that time, that I had constructed an idol in my life. And in large part, it looked like what we do whenever we gather on Sunday mornings or Wednesday nights or whenever the church gathers and we do what we call worship. And I think that the scarier reality was whenever I began to connect the lifelessness that I was feeling on Sunday mornings or whenever the church gathers to the way that I actually felt in the rest of my life. The scary part was not that Sunday mornings were lifeless for me. The scary part was that it was a microcosm, it was a picture of what was actually happening in the rest of my life. The problem was not just that Sunday mornings felt lifeless and mundane and cumbersome. It's that all of life felt lifeless and mundane and cumbersome. It's that all of life was lifeless. And in that moment, I recognized this idol that I'd built. And I think, I'm assuming a lot, but having worked in worship ministry for some time now, I think that for many of us, we can relate. I think for many of us, we have those moments whenever we wonder, why are we even here? Is this really all it's about? Is this it? Is this it? Every single time I see worship happening in the Bible, is it really just surrounded by, is it really encompassed in the 5 songs that I sing on Sunday morning that I might or might not even like? Is this really it? I just want to say, if you can relate to that feeling this morning, I think we all get there to some degree. We all wonder why. We all wonder, is this really the fullness of what it means to be a follower of Jesus? Is this really what worship is? I just want to say that I know that feeling. I've been there. But I also want to say this, and this is the beautiful part, is that it's whenever we take on that confession, whenever we admit that something's not right, whenever we're willing to recognize the lifelessness, whenever we're willing to recognize the void, whenever we're willing to recognize this deep darkness in our own life, this boredom in our own life, whenever we get to that point in that space, it's whenever God is able to do something incredible. It's whenever we're willing to take on a posture of humility and recognize that indeed things are not right, that we're barren and we're void, and that this is not what I thought it was. When we're willing to confess that, God's able to create in us a new thing. God is able to do a new thing. God is able to resurrect that which is in us. Why? Because everything starts here. Everything starts with nothingness. Everything starts with the recognition of the barren void that we feel in our lives. Genesis chapter 1. Everything starts here. For in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was formless and it was void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. Everything starts with nothingness. The word in Hebrew for create is literally the word bara. And bara means to bring something out of nothing, literally to breathe life into, and even to take it further, to give function and purpose. And so God, looking at this nothingness, this barren landscape, begins to create vitality and beauty and all these things from these humble beginnings. He begins to create mountains, and he begins to create oceans and animals and all of these things. And all of these things culminate on the 6th day. On the 6th day, whenever God creates man. When God creates man. I think you need to turn your guitar on. whenever God creates man. And in this space, God creates man, and everything culminates. And right here in this place, we see that worship is established. We see that worship comes into being with humanity. You see, this is the beautiful thing. Whenever God creates man, he calls them the icon, which we talked about. In Hebrew, the word is the tessalem. Literally the image of God. The image of God. You guys can look over this way. It's a guitar, and his name is Adam. Say everyone say hi, Adam. You're on. You're on. We roll with it, right? So literally the tessalem of God, the icon of God, the image of God. We good? We good? Sweet. Okay, the image of God in the world. Now, sorry, I got flustered there. All right, everybody take a step back. So the testimony of God, the image of God in the world, literally the reflection of God in the world. And that's what worship is at its most base form. It's a created thing reflecting that which created it. It's whenever a created thing casts light on the thing that created it. And so what we see like throughout the world is that created things inherently worship. Who do we think of whenever we see the Mona Lisa? Leonardo da Vinci. And so in its existence, Mona Lisa tells us something about Leonardo. Or whenever we hear the words to don't stop believing, right? And everyone's like, yeah. Journey, surviving with me, Suddenly there's this connection that obviously created things. Obviously, just in some way, in some inherent form, they worship the thing that created it. Now, the drama comes into play whenever God gives humanity agency, responsibility, free will. And what happens? Within 3 chapters, we know that man chooses self. Turns inwardly, turns the recognition from God, from Creator God, to self. And suddenly, it's not about the question no longer, it is not who or what if we will worship, the question of who. Will we continue as image bearers of the living God to live as his image in the world, casting light on him, acting as a created thing, bringing recognition to him and glory to him? Or will the gods of self and greed and progress and money and sex, will they actually be the thing that gets our attention and our reflection in the world? And so we have to start here. We have to start here with this humble recognition, this posture of humility that says, indeed, God, there are other gods who compete for my affection. And many times they win out. Oftentimes they win out. Maybe even most of the time they win out. Now, I love music. It's a central part of my life. And I think for most of us, whenever we talk about worship, we immediately think of music. I don't think that's a bad thing. Music has this incredible power to connect us, to connect people from different socioeconomic statuses and demographics and different cultures. It's got this amazing power to bring people of different languages together. We all can most of us can relate to this moment whenever we're singing at the top of our lungs, because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Or if you're below the age of 21 and you only like songs that have 5 words, oh, how he loves us. Oh, how he loves. Like we recognize that there's power in that. We also recognize, too, that music has this incredible, there's all kinds of possibilities when people come together surrounded by music. In 1984, if you were born in 1984, or before 1984, you might remember Live Aid. Whenever 2 stadiums on opposite sides of the globe, they decided to meet for 24 hours straight to hold concerts. And they hold these concerts to stand in solidarity with those suffering from the AIDS epidemic in Africa. And they raise over $81 million in a day. Music is powerful. But this morning, I want to challenge the assumption that music is not in and of itself what worship is. It's just a small portion. I do love music, and I want to use the language of music to maybe teach us a little bit about what worship actually is. So, starting out, we have to talk about rhythm. Rhythm. Rhythm's the starting point, the lifeblood, the driving force of all music. It's what brings pace and tempo and rest. It's that thing that drives the song along. Without it, songs are thrown into chaos. They have no structure. They have no ebb and flow. And we all know what this is like, right? Because we all need this. We all need rhythm to life. We all need ebb and flow, and rest and movement. We all know what it's like. We've all seen pictures of what happens in our society whenever people lose rhythm in life, have no rhythm in life. We've seen the marriages that have failed because the husband just can't leave the office. Right? Maybe that's your story. Marriage failed because I just couldn't put my work down. Or families that lose touch with one another because they're just so busy taking the kids from one place to the next. It's from school to sports practice, to piano, to home to do homework. And along the way, we never even connected as a family. And so we lose touch with our kids. We lose touch with our spouses. We all know what this is like. We live in America where work and movement, and it's just what we do. Dinner tables are a rarity, right? And so God talks about this ebb and this flow. He talks about it and he sets it up from the beginning, and he calls it Sabbath. Or in Hebrew, literally the word Shabbat. Now, Shabbat, Sabbath, we see in Genesis 1 and verse 27 that God begins to create movement in humanity by giving them purpose. He commissions them to go and subdue and to rule over the earth. And in doing so, they have a purpose, they have a vocation, they have movement, right? But then on the second day, or on the seventh day, what does God do? He rests. And in doing so, he weaves into the fabric of existence this rest of movement and rest, movement and rest. And then what we see is that we further this is Israel's a tribe of slaves who comes out of slavery, and they have never rested a day in their life, many of them. For 400 years they've been in slavery and they've never rested. They've worked every day. And so God brings them to Mount Sinai and he gives them these 10 commandments. These 10 tenets to what it means to be a human in God's world. And what do we see? Central to Israelite lifestyle was this idea of rest. Each week, rest, Sabbath. And it is taken further. In Leviticus 23, God sets up, this is crazy, God sets up these rhythms to life that also go out throughout the year. And so in Leviticus 23, what we see is God commands Israel. He says, listen, every year, whenever you have your harvest, what I want you to do is I want you to go to Jerusalem and I want you to live in a booth for a week. It's called the Feast of the Booths, or the Feast of the Tabernacles. And so they would go and they would spend a week with their entire family, all of their friends, their acquaintances, the poor. Their entire cities would go to Jerusalem. And they would spend a week and they would rejoice and they would rest and they would thank God for his provision throughout the last year, providing rhythm. Literally, take a vacation. Rest. Don't be defined by movement alone. And then he takes it even further by Deuteronomy 14, by talking about sabbatical year and year of Jubilee. And so in Deuteronomy 14, what we see is that God says, listen, don't just rest for one day a week or 7 days a year, but also every seventh year, I want you to take an entire year off. I want you to allow the land to rest. I want you to allow yourself to rest. In doing so, I want you to trust me that I am God and that I provide. And then he takes it even further and he says, and not just that, but here's what we're going to do. Every 7 years, if you've accrued debts that you can't get paid off, they're done. They're erased. You're forgiven. If you've gone and bore yourself into slavery, if you've gone and squandered your life and now you're in slavery, you're forgiven. You're set free. And then to take it even further, every 49 years, Jubilee. An entire restart button for their nation. Literally, a year off to allow the land to rest, to allow you to rest, to celebrate the provision of God. A year where all debts were erased, all slaves were set free. Land was returned to original owners. Can you imagine for a moment what this might look like? Anyone have student loans, credit card debts, mortgage payments? Anyone feel the weight of your finances on your life? You feel like you just can't keep up? How am I going to pay that bill? The mortgage is coming up, but I've got to go to the grocery store because my kids got to eat. Can you imagine what God is doing when he says, that doesn't have to be the rhythm of your life? Debts erased, slaves set free. God gives us rhythm to life so that we can actually live. He gives us rhythm to life so that we can actually focus on the things that matter. He gives us rhythm in life, ebb and flow to life, so that we can focus on relationships over work. That bucket list item we never seem to be able to check off the list. Rhythms and rest so that we can actually engage in those things because they matter to God. He's far more concerned about the relationships in your life than your progress at work. He's far more concerned that you spend time playing catch with your sons than he is you bringing home $100,000 a year. So he establishes ebb and flow to life. What could that look like? If you weren't consumed, if we weren't consumed by progress and movement. Now, after you establish a rhythm, you have to establish a melody. Melodies are the melodic progressions that songs orbit around. They're the central point. Without a melody, there's no meaning. Your song is just a useless conglomerations of beats and movement and rest, and really makes no sense. And so melodies, they're the central point of the song. They're that thing that brings the rest of the song together. The melody's that hook you can't ever seem to get out of your head. It's the thing that you remember most when you hear a song for the first time. It's that thing that holds everything else together. And so for ancient Jews, when they talked about melody, they were talking about faithfulness to Abrahamic covenant. For them, they believed that we are God's people, we are chosen, we are called out, and we are separate. And this is the orbit of our life. This is the central point of our life. So we do everything we can in the way we eat, in the way we have ebb and flow in our lives, in the way we treat our neighbors, in the way that we treat foreigners, in the way we treat the unclean and the sick. Like we have this orbit point in our life, and it's covenant, and we keep it. And we order our life around it. And that was their melody. And we all have melodies. We are all centering ourselves around a melody. Take a moment. Take a moment and ask yourself, what is it that consumes most of my time? What is it that consumes my time? What consumes my thoughts? What am I actually spending my time caring about? And in that moment, you might be revealing the melody of your life. You see, in the first century, whenever Christianity comes around, there's this just dynamic shift that occurs. What once the orbit point was once Abrahamic covenant, this central point of like we order our lives around we are God's people and we should separate ourselves, and we separate ourselves through our diet and through all sorts of just insane guidelines and all these things. Now the orbit point becomes the person and the work of Jesus. First century Christians, they placed Jesus, the person of Jesus, at the center of their orbit. It was that thing that held everything else together. It was that thing that gave everything else meaning, and it changed everything. They're giving their lives. They're giving their possessions. They are giving everything to this melody. And Paul says it really well. Whenever he's talking to the church in Colossae, he says this. He says, he is the image of the invisible God. He's the firstborn of all creation. In him, all things in heaven and on earth were created. Things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers, all things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Paul is taking Jesus and he's saying Jesus is the melody of this song. He is the central point. Everything in this world orbits around this covenant-fulfilling, resurrected Savior who redeems who calls out, who adopts. This person is now the orbit point. He is the melody. He's the thing that brings meaning to the rest of the song. So the question this morning is Christ the melody of our lives? And the manner that we live, is Christ at the center? Really, is Christ at the center? And the way that we love, is Christ at the center? Is he at the center? Is Christ the melody that brings meaning to the rest of our song? Now, you might be saying, Blake, yeah, I love Jesus. Like for many of us, I don't think it would be hard for many of us to be like, yeah, I love Jesus. I love Jesus. Like sure, I'm busy, I have work, I have my family, I have all these things, but yeah, of course I love Jesus. And you might be asking, so how can I know fully, is he really, I want to take a moment and really ask the question, how can I know that Christ is actually the melody of the song that I'm singing? How can I actually know that Christ is the central point of my life? Now to talk about that, we have to talk about this amazing thing called harmony. Now, music has all kinds of possibilities. When you layer particular notes on top of one another, when you take two different notes that fit well together and you layer them on top of each other, you create sound that's beautiful and that's compelling and it's invigorating. It can be haunting. Harmony is what brings color to a song. The best harmonies, what they do is they glorify the central melody. Harmonies aren't meant to take away from what the melody is, but it's actually meant to bolster the melody up. So if you don't have harmonies that match your melody, then something's amiss, something's wrong, something's out of tune. It might be that you're actually trying to center your harmonies around a different melody. They're not congruent. But if your harmonies don't match your melodies, something is wrong. And you can't have harmonies without a melody. Melodies are the central point. A harmony does not exist unless there's a melody to place it around. Now, so whenever we're talking about harmonies, God has a way of talking about harmony. What we see is the Bible, whenever it talks about harmony in life, it uses this amazing word called shalom. Shalom. Israelite people, literally, it was a greeting. Like they would wish for shalom on their neighbors. It was kind of this thing like shalom to you. Like shalom, shalom. And the way that we say God bless you or something like that, shalom. And it literally means peace, wholeness with God. But the thing about shalom is that for ancient Israelites, shalom, the way that you knew one had shalom with God, peace with God, wholeness with God, vitality with God, was whenever it was displayed through shalom with neighbor, with those around you. They took this incredibly seriously. The way that I know that there's shalom with God is whenever I display it with peace with my neighbor. And now, Jesus In the person of Jesus, he takes it farther. He takes it further. And he literally says this: you cannot have shalom with God without shalom with neighbor. In Matthew chapter 22, whenever Jesus is asked about the greatest commandment, he says this. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And, or normally, period, separate statement. He says, and, second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And you're fulfilling the law of the prophets. Jesus takes this idea of shalom with God, and he says it's not just displayed in love for neighbor, but these two are in dance together. They're in this incredible circular movement with each other. You cannot have one without the other. Literally, at one point, he says this. He says, if you forgive your neighbor, you will be forgiven to the extent that you forgive. He constantly is placing shalom with God, peace with God, wholeness with God on that peace with neighbors. He goes as far as to say this in Matthew 5, loving your enemies. And he doesn't, let me just be clear, he doesn't clarify that statement. He just literally says, love your enemies. And the audience he's talking to are being killed and persecuted by Romans. Crucified, nailed to trees on the side of the road. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. He goes so far to say, in concerning forgiveness and retaliation. He even goes on to say in John 13 that love of others is the marker of a follower of Jesus. Literally, they're not going to know you by your great doctrine or your church attendance or how well you do this or that. They're actually going to know you by how well you love each other. It's compelling. It's compelling. And then he goes on, John 21, whenever he reinstitutes Peter into the fold, what does he say? This is the man that